Hey everyone, Tera Roberts here with FantasyPros bringing you another round of 10 players to cut. Before we get started, make sure that you like this video and subscribe to FantasyPros across all platforms. Now let's go ahead and dive right in with players to cut from 12 and 14 team leagues. First up, Ben Roethlisberger. The only reason Ben Roethlisberger is still rostered in 21% of Yahoo leagues and 15.9% of ESPN leagues is that he is a future Hall of Famer, he is playing on one of the most popular teams in the NFL, and he has a pretty nice arsenal of weapons. Let's do a little breakdown comparison to see why Big Ben just isn't worth it. This season, 25 quarterbacks have already scored 100 fantasy points. Big Ben is sitting at 28th with just 93.84 fantasy points. Jimmy Garoppolo, on the other hand, is rostered in 11% of Yahoo leagues and 4.2% of ESPN leagues, and he has 94.12 fantasy points in one less game. Big Ben is one of the best quarterbacks to ever play the game. He will be in Canton one day, but he has no business being on a fantasy football roster right now. You need to let him go. Next up, David Johnson. David Johnson was a hot addition last week because of the Houston Texans trading Mark Ingram to the New Orleans Saints, which in theory should have cleared out the backfield. It only makes sense that Johnson and Phillip Lindsay would see a larger role with Ingram out of the mix. But this is the Texans. Throw what makes sense out of the window. Let's break down what happened on Sunday. Rex Burkhead led the Texans backfield with 12.3 fantasy points. Scottie Phillips checked in with 3 fantasy points, and David Johnson and Phillip Lindsay were next in line with 0.8 fantasy points. Yes, 0.8 fantasy points. At this point, the backfield is just plain useless because they are very insistent on splitting carries among literally every running back that is active. Unless your league decides winners based on the team with the fewest amount of fantasy points, I would send Johnson to the waivers at this point. The floor is just too low and the ceiling is not high enough in this Texans offense. Next up, Brandon Bolden. Ramondre Stevenson was on the list last week, and this week it's another New England running back, Brandon Bolden. There was some hope that Bolden would emerge as the James White of this offense, and he's rostered in 14.1% of Yahoo leagues and 11.1% of ESPN leagues. The problem is that Mac Jones is just becoming more comfortable within this offense. They're not checking down as much to the running back, and the Patriots targeted their running backs only 3 times in their win over the Los Angeles Chargers in Week 8. If you take out that one outlier game against the Jets, when Brandon Bolden caught 6 of his 7 targets for 79 yards and 1 touchdown in Week 7, Bolden was the 58th ranked running back from Week 3 to Week 6, and in Week 8, he was the 59th ranked running back. It's starting to look like he just had an outlier week in that blowout victory against the Jets, and that this is not really an expanded role that's going to lead to meaningful fantasy value. At this point, we shouldn't be rostering any Patriots running backs outside of Damian Harris. Next up, Laviska Shenault. I hate to say this, I really do. We had such high hopes for Shenault coming into the season, only to be smacked with the reality of his limited usage. We thought that when DJ Chark was lost for the season after Week 4, that Shenault would be in line to see a larger role in this offense, which makes sense because that's how it would work on any other NFL team, but that has not been the case in Jacksonville. This offense is just hard to figure out because there's no logic or reason to how the targets are distributed from week to week. But Shenault has seen 3 targets, 10 targets, and 4 targets in his last 3 games. Shenault was the 49th ranked wide receiver in his 2 games after DJ Chark's injury, and then coming off of the bye week, he finished as the 75th ranked wide receiver. Instead, we've seen players like Jamal Agnew and Dan Arnold become the big beneficiaries of Chark's absence. Shenault is one of many good Jaguars players that needs competent coaching to be a consistent fantasy option. Unfortunately, it's time to let go of Shenault and go for a player on waivers with more upside and more consistent targets. Next up, Robby Anderson. It's time to let go of Robby Anderson. We've tried to make excuses and tried to use targets as a reason to roster him, but quite frankly, this one should be pretty quick. We'll go ahead and break down why Robby Anderson needs to be cut. The biggest red flag is that he only saw 1 target last week, which was not the norm for him. Targets were the only reason to keep him around. He had 38 targets from week 4 to week 7 with no game where he saw fewer than 7 targets. However, this has not translated to meaningful fantasy production. He had just 22.9 fantasy points in those 4 games, and now we have a player that was targeted just 1 time. I just wouldn't roster him going forward at this point. Sam Darnold is struggling too much, and honestly, he wasn't doing that much before. Just let him go. Next up, Jonnu Smith. Jonnu Smith simply isn't the tight end 1 of this offense and cannot be productive enough to be worthy of a roster spot. Smith had 2 targets, 2 receptions, and 13 yards last week. He is the 34th ranked fantasy tight end with 14.6 fantasy points in 4 games. Hunter Henry, however, had 39.1 fantasy points in those same 4 games. Henry has emerged as the top tight end in this offense, and while the Patriots offense is improving, it's not going to be good enough to support 2 fantasy tight ends. Smith should be on the waiver and not on fantasy rosters. Moving on to shallow leagues, and first up is Matt Ryan. Ryan is one of those players I can never figure out if I want on my roster. Let's break down the numbers to understand why he is such a confusing player to roster. Matt Ryan had thrown for multiple touchdowns in 5 games straight, and he appeared to be on the upswing. He then went out and threw for 146 yards, 1 touchdown, and 2 picks last week. His 8.14 fantasy points was ranked 31st for quarterbacks this week, which is a special kind of horrible, seeing as that there were only 30 starting quarterbacks. Matt Ryan was so bad that both Winston and Simeon outscored him. Normally, I would not cut him based off of 1 game. Everyone has 1 bad game. But the problem is, what is his fantasy appeal going to be moving forward with Calvin Ridley inactive for the foreseeable future? It's a lot easier to take away Kyle Pitts downfield if you don't have to worry about Calvin Ridley. But on the other hand, Ridley did miss 1 game against the New York Jets, and in that game, Matt Ryan had 21.58 fantasy points that week. So there is a small, inconsistent sample size of the Falcons games played without Calvin Ridley. Fantasy managers are going to have to look at the waivers and see what makes sense. Ryan faces the Saints defense this week that is 11th against fantasy quarterbacks, and then follows that up with the Cowboys defense that is ranked 4th against fantasy quarterbacks over the last 3 weeks. After that is the Patriots defense, who are 10th ranked against fantasy quarterbacks. In shallow leagues, fantasy managers are going to have a tough call to make with a quarterback that is without his best wide receiver and has some tough matchups on the horizon. Next up, Alex Collins. I know what you're thinking, why are we cutting the lead back on team when we don't know when the RB1 will be coming off IR? I get it, but hear me out. It's a little crazy that in a game where Seattle led 24-0 before Jacksonville scored their first touchdown, Collins only saw 10 carries. On top of that, Rashad Penny saw 7 carries. If that continues going forward, Collins is going to be unplayable in shallow leagues with just 10 carries per game and an equal time share with Rashad Penny. This follows a week where Collins had only 4.4 fantasy points and was the 34th ranked running back with 6 teams on a bye week. This kind of split could end up being a budget version of Devontae Williams and Melvin Gordon, and I don't want the budget version of that. There's some excitement that Russell Wilson is coming back in Week 10 after the Seattle Seahawks bye week, and that would be a boom for all fantasy players. However, in shallow leagues, it's going to be difficult to roster Collins through a bye week, hoping that he will see more than 10 carries in Week 10 against a Packers team that has been playing much better on defense in recent weeks. They draw the Arizona Cardinals in Week 11. If you need a roster spot to fill in shallow leagues, Collins is a candidate to let hit the waiver wire. Next up, Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley surprised the fantasy football world when he announced that he was stepping away from the game to focus on his mental health. I wish nothing but the best for Calvin Ridley in his recovery. While football is an important part of my life, it's not more important than any player's emotional and mental well-being. But we do have to look at the implications from a fantasy football perspective for our purposes. What is the fantasy impact of this decision? It's hard to know because all his statement said was that he would be taking a step back to focus on mental health. It didn't say that he wouldn't play again in 2021. It didn't even say if his absence would be for more than 1 week, although we can assume that this will be a lengthy absence. There's also the fact that Ridley wasn't exactly a top fantasy asset before he decided to take a step away from the game. Ridley was the 25th ranked fantasy wide receiver from week 1 to week 4. That is not a horrible showing, but it's nowhere near the production that people expected when they made him their second round pick. In a deep league or a league where you have IR spots and Ridley qualifies with an IR tag, it could make sense to stash him and see if he returns to football later in the year. In a shallow league, however, it might not make sense to keep him on your roster. It's possible he does not play football again this year. If you're unable to put him on an IR spot, it's best to let him go to waivers. And finally, Jared Cook. Let's keep this one short and sweet. Jared Cook has failed to break 30 yards receiving in 5 of his 7 games this year. So the only way that he has been fantasy relevant is if he scores a touchdown. He has a nice matchup this week against the Philadelphia Eagles, but there's just not that much appeal holding on to a player that has averaged just 6.9 fantasy points since week 2. I would rather take a flyer on a guy like Pat Freiermuth in his back-to-back solid games rather than continue to roll out Cook and his meager fantasy numbers in a shallow league. And that wraps things up for this week's Players to Cut. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to FantasyPros across all platforms. Thank you for watching, and be sure to come back next week for another round of Players to Cut.